Welcome to ABA On Call with Rick Kubina and Doug Kostewicz. Explore insightful ABA discussions. Stick around for a chance to earn a CEU. Listen for 3 secret words, note them, and claim your CEU after the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to ABA On Call. Doug, this is our 6th season. Can you believe it?
Season premiere, 6th season. My goodness. I think we're just getting old is all that it is.
That could be. And
Yep.
dear listeners, thank you. We would not have one season without your support and without you all giving us feedback, high fives, friendly comments when we see you at different events. We love it all and thank you. And we're excited for this next season. Now, we talk about ABA because that has been almost in our DNA. Doug and I met at Ohio State University way back in the day, and Doug came to Ohio State as a behavior analyst already from Allegheny. I came as a behavior analyst from Youngstown State. And it has just been so much fun talking about behavior analysis. And I suppose, like you said, Doug, we are the veterans. We are the old folks in the room. That happens if you stick around long enough.
Yeah, I guess so. Now that I'm thinking about it. Yeah, we are the old folks.
Well,
So
let's pull up a groove and get cool.
Okay.
So today we're going to talk about 2 contributions to Skinner. And when we get to the 3rd section, this is something that if you're listening to this podcast and you want to get better with the way you do science, this is how you do it. And
no lie.
there are 2 things that, Skinner, there's an article that he wrote back in 76. It was called Farewell, My Lovely. And in there, he talks about 2 of his great contributions. One is rate of response, AKA frequency. The other is the cumulative response recorder. So in this first section, Doug, let's talk about rate of response. Let me pop quiz you. What is rate of response?
So it's behavior, instance of behavior over time. So it's how many times you do something. And it is one of the core aspects of behavior in time, which you can't behave out of time. So it's nice to really look at that. And if you go back to when Skinner was working in these experimental spaces, previous to that, a lot of the responses weren't to rate. It was left to a lot of psychological testing, lots of answers to tests, to observations where the person would make interpretations of behavior. But Skinner looked at behavior over time.
Yeah. That's good that you're bringing us back to early psychology. If any of you have had a class on the history of psych, you may remember there were 5 main schools of thought. Behaviorism was a school of thought, but if you looked at functionalism, William James or psychoanalysis and Skinner, none of these folks, like you pointed out, were actually they are trying to deconstruct how humans and why humans do what they do. But Skinner's like, no, we're going to get in the lab, we're going to apply natural science, and we're going to figure this out. And his a bedrock measure in figuring this out was the rate of response. How often does this organism respond in time? And it was universal because another thing you said is everybody does things in time. And if you compare universals, then I could go to your lab in Pittsburgh and understand what the heck's going on. You could come to my lab in State College. Likewise, you wouldn't be like, wait, what's going on? What'd you ask this person? No, it's a fundamental universal measure of time. And that just was so important to Skinner. And that's why he claimed, looking back at towards the end of his career, this was a bedrock, a foundational metric of measurement.
Yeah, and it took interpretation out, right? So if you're looking at the early behaviors, there was, let's say you're looking at lever press, right? An instance of a lever press is a behavioral datum. It had to apply enough force to do it. And if it did, then it was counted. Then how many times it happened became different behaviors, right? So if you do something once in 20 minutes, that is so much different than doing it 20 times in 20 minutes or 200 times in 20 minutes. And just in all three cases, they're pressing a lever, right? But they're not the same thing. And his ability to say, we're going to focus on this, and then we're going to look at it over time, allowed so much of his inductive discovery over the next 20, 30, 40 years that have allowed us to move behavior analysis where it is.
Yeah. And we'll hit upon this more later, but when you're thinking about rate of response or frequency, the differences in how well you can do things not only is different behavior. If we look at it very deeply, we would probably also find out that people feel differently about themselves. For example, you're in a classroom with kids who are reading, and you're second grade, and second graders should be reading. You have someone that can read at 125 words per minute, or even 100 words per minute, with between 0 and 3 errors, let's say, or even 0 and 5 errors. There's another kid that comes in and can read 20 words per minute with 10. You think that kid is going to feel is good at, even though it's the same exact behavior, the feelings that are associated, there's obviously social uh, issues that go on with that too, but you feel how well you can do these behaviors, and it certainly can affect you.
And it differentiates performance too. So you think about running, taking a step very quickly is very different to being able to take 1,000 steps very quickly. And you look at, you know, elite athletes and what they can do. I mean, I can run as fast as an elite athlete for one step,
Yeah.
but I can't do it for all the, so understanding that going down to that smallest level allows for an analysis that would be lost on us if we stayed at those higher those higher order things of, let's think about running, let's think about thinking, let's think about all these other things versus looking at this very objectively and then placing that behavior, because movement in time is what behavior is. Putting that behavior in time allows for such a fine-grained analysis. And it's obvious why Skinner chose it as one of his major measurement contributions to behavior.
Yes. It's so core to everything that we've discovered, and it's so core to the applied world. Everything that you look at, social skills, uh, eating, whatever you're interested in, what's the behavior of interest? If you can't figure out the frequency, then uh, you have a hard time of comparing these. Like, there are other measures you could look at, other fundamental measures. You could look at latency, you could look at duration, but even those can be flipped and turned uh, into rate of response, which would help you do this comparison. You have this true continuum of behaviors. Now, Lindsley, he wrote this great article back in '91 where he thanked Skinner for giving these incredible metrics for us to understand the world, and also the cumulative response reporter, which we'll talk about in our next segment. But he said that once people understood that sound could be put on this continuum in light, all of a sudden the scientists were able to do so much more with it. And it's the same exact thing with behavior analysis.
Yeah, you made me think of something that I always talk about, and that you said, you can look at duration, you can look at latency, but I always think about sitting in a chair, right? And we want to talk about time in chair or time, and we go with duration. But if you look at really the frequency you should shoot for is sits once, right? If you sit once, then you are not getting up the rest of the time. And that's a different behavior than a child who sits 32 times.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's amazing how frequency you can go back to it, and it's so powerful. But I think that brings us to our first word,
It does.
and that is time.
Very well.
Okay.
Then let's move right in to our second segment,
Yep.
which Skinner, his other great contribution wasn't like I wouldn't consider a graph or a visual display measurement, but what it does is it shows measurement. It's a visual
Right.
display. And not only was it a visual display, it was a standard visual display. It was called the cumulative response recorder because you have these
Right.
responses, this rate of response, and what would you do with it? You put it on this beautiful uh, the records that were made were just beautiful. It was stunning when people could see. You could be in your lab. If I showed you this procedure and said, do this, and then independent of me, completely, you see that same picture emerge on this visual display. That is just beautiful science, as far as I'm concerned.
And think about how many, I mean, schedules of reinforcement came from the use of the cumulative response recorder
That's right.
and putting responses on a standardized display. And what he was able to show and discover was schedules of reinforcement. It just repeated over and over again. When you have that standard display, the interpretation is done for you. And using that finite datum of response combined with the standardized display allowed for so much of the bedrock of behavior analysis that we just take for granted, that we just incorporate into everything we do. Oh, why are we going to look at this schedule? Why are we going to look at this variable ratio schedule? Well, we only learned about that was because of the combination of understanding response rate and plotted on a cumulative response recorder.
Yeah. If we revisit the theme that we just talked about, which was going back historically and looking at the 5 schools of thought, how do we think any of these other schools of thought could really come across a wonderful, like, let's say you're a psychoanalyst. What you're doing is you're sitting down with the person. You have this theory that you just made up, which was the psychoanalytic theory, which was these psychosexual stages. And you have a person and you're doing pre-association. You're recording what the person says. There's zero standardization in that entire process. I mean, forget the fact that Freud made up all that stuff. But yet, if you are trying to understand human behavior and you're doing this, you're question asking and looking for these great fundamental truths of behavior, you're never going to get there. But yet Skinner started off with this metric and he had the standard display. Like here's the analogy, Doug. Skinner wasn't looking at the rat per se. Like he wasn't looking there in having his eyes on. No, what Skinner looked at is he set up this experimental chamber. He had all of these things going. He had all of these controls going. And then this picture emerged because if it was a rat and would press the lever, then there'd be a tick mark on the cumulative response recorder. And depending on how fast it touched that, clicked that, these different patterns would emerge. And just how because Skinner was a natural scientist, you can see how behavior analysis flourished and came into being, Whereas so many other schools of thought, even to this day, if you go and look what other people are doing, they're nowhere near the power of behavior analysis, because fundamentally the way they measure behavior and display behavior is just so far removed from how we do it.
Well, and what was really nice is not just thinking about the rat with the lever. It was universal in that these behaviors, these operant behaviors that Skinner would identify, transcended different animals, transcended different behaviors, transcended to humans. You started to see that when you distill the behavior and you're looking at it on this standard display, you see the same schedules, you see the same pictures emerging when you have these types of conditions. That is outstanding. And it, as you said, propelled us, would lump us in right with the behavior analysts, propelled us forward to, and then eventually lead us to ABA, where we're now, we're going to use all these techniques and all this information to help people. And so it's amazing that all this bedrock didn't matter what it was. When you distilled it to rate, when you just put it on the cumulative recorder, you saw the same similar patterns emerge, and they were all done through visual analysis.
Yeah. Skinner talked so much about visual analysis, but the regularities in nature, when you can see them in your data, that is science. That is allowing us to truly understand nature. You have this question, you set up this experiment, here's your answer. It can be replicated, you can make predictions, and ultimately you can have control. That's
And it demystifies, right? We don't need to add so many non-parsimonious explanations
amen.
for what's going on. You can limit to what you are able to see. And as long as you've arranged things in such a way, meaning whatever the control, the conditions are, you start to see that pattern. It's right there.
Yeah. When everybody can compare equally and not have any questions and you're reducing interpretation error, that's going to push forward your science. And we're talking a lot about the basic science, but there is absolutely no reason this can't be done in the applied world. If we look at medicine, if you're a doctor's like a family practitioner or someone in the emergency room, they are applied practitioners, and you get an ECG in this heart rate that you have, which is a physical event, which is interpreted through this machine and is shown in a standard format. Every single person, whether it's a doctor, a nurse, or whoever learns to interpret those patterns will know this is regular. Uh-oh, this is a problem. Oh, this is why this problem could be happening because of this pattern that we see from this physical event. Same exact analogy with behavior analysis.
Well, that brings us to secret word number 2, and that word is standard. Okay, Rick, it's now time for part 3. We covered the 2 big contributions that Skinner felt that he made to measurement. Now, what happens when we as a science begin to move away from these 4 contributions to measurement? What happens when we stop or use, not very often, measure frequency, or we choose not to use something that is standardized? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, here's the bottom line. we get less effective. And I'll try to keep this unemotional. Obviously, when you have a lot of passion for the applied science because you understand that you're changing lives, and then all of a sudden, here's some people arguing that, hey, let's use this less effective thing. It's hard not to get pissed off about that. It's hard not
Right.
to like lose your control, but you got to be a scientist. You got to be dispassionate. You just got to be like, look, uh, it's not as effective as if you were doing this. And very simply, uh, what do many people do when it comes to measurement? We talked about rate of response, and there's other fundamental units that you could use if you weren't using rate of response, but we are talking
Right.
about rate of response. People are using dimensionless quantities. They're using, but before they use a dimensionless quantity, let's go back to uh, observation. So they are observing with discontinuous observation, and
Yep.
have continuous observation when you have a frequency, because if you have this window and you're continuously watching, is it happening? Is it not happening? And that could be done mechanically, as what Skinner did when the rat was, or what many people do in the field is they actually look. But we, somewhere along the line, have said, you know what? It's okay to disregard those measures, and these are just as good. And in fact, I don't want to spend this entire time talking about this, but I certainly could. There are articles out there, Doug, where people will show you like, hey, this is just as good if you use discontinuous observation, which then happens to be in a metric. So discontinuous observation means interval recording. And what are you going to get out of interval recording? You're going to get dimensionless measure, like a percent. And once you deal with those two things, you're being less effective than if you had continuous measurement and you had a dimensional quantity. Boy,
Right.
that's a lot of technical terms there, but that's the answer.
Well, and then, so let's compound this. So you take a discontinuous measurement of a dimensionless quantity and you place it on a non-standard visual display that more than likely is constructed in a manner that limits your ability for visual interpretation. So you have broken data going on a broken display. When you add those two together, do you think that you are likely to make non-broken interpretation? Do you think you're making the best decisions for the clients, the kids, the adults that you work with? Heck, for yourself, you are likely not making the most efficient and effective decision simply because you move away from the two core aspects that we talked about with regards to measurement. That's Skinner, in his own words, said this was what led us down this path. And that was frequency and standardized display. I'm sorry, but I know that you don't want to be passionate and you want to try to stay dispassionate, but it's hard. It's hard to see the use of these defended, perpetuated.
Yeah.
I don't know what Skinner would say about it.
Yeah. Well, here's a fact. And this isn't, as we're talking, these aren't opinions. So here's a
No.
fact. And the fact is this: if you are using some kind of interval recording system, and there's many different ones you have out there, let's say momentary time sampling, where you're trying to capture the behavior at a specific moment. And I've done this exercise in class. Uh, any time you use an interval recording, it's going to either overestimate the behavior or underestimate behavior, depending on how you set it up. And I do this exercise with momentary time sampling where it's a little stick figure and it hits its head against the wall. When you count it with frequency or rate of response, you get 16 in a minute. When you do momentary time sampling, you get 0. And this is a fact. Now, does that happen every time? Probably not. No, not for sure. But still, in what world would anybody want to take a chance? This is why I do not ever use any kind of interval sampling. Like the arguments, there are many arguments out there. You can find the papers that will defend them, and they'll say like, "Oh, there's not enough time for it, or it's easier to use." There's a counter argument to use a dimensional quantity which will give you better results. And you are absolutely right. It is compounded. So when you're losing information with your measurement, it is compounded. You're more compromised when now, and again, it depends on how you set up your graph. Some people know how to create good graphs. And if you create a good graph that's even non-standard, you can make sense of that and gather some information, but you might not be doing that. And, who's the police? Who's looking over your shoulder saying, boy, you violated, and you and I have done this research, and we have seen that when you look at graphs, more than 80% of the graphs that are being made out there have at least one issue. And many of the studies that are now coming out have these other graph construction issues. So it's just all unknown. We have no way of understanding across the discipline how compromised people's decisions are clinically because of all of these issues.
And let's take this one step further. Why in the world do we think that we can make any of the types of discoveries that Skinner did? He was able to take, because everything was standard. Not only that, Rick, but how do we think that we can look and find the same inductive findings that Skinner had when he looked at standard displays from many different animals, from many different behaviors, and saw that? Why do we think that we can take displays that are non-standard, that are probably not created properly, with discontinuous measurement and dimensionless data, and start to, because we are doing really great things and we're helping, but we don't know how effective certain things are. We are left to trying to help one person, doing our best, rather than pulling together very effective techniques that could then, we can see similar effects across multiple clients.
That's a great point. We said earlier, if you want to make a change, do this. Use a dimensional quantity, rate of response, if you could. That should always be your number. I would say in maybe 80 to 90% of situations, you could use rate of
Yeah.
response or frequency. And maybe there's 10 to 20% of times when you might want to use latency or duration or just a count only. I mean, you can even do that. And use some kind of standard visual display. I mean, obviously, you and I are advocates of using the standard acceleration chart, but even if you were using a standard linear graph that stayed the same, was constructed properly, you'd be making
Scaled
better
properly.
decisions. You'd be
Yeah.
making,
Sorry, what is scaled properly? It's so, I mean, the picture changes. You have to keep it objective and honest.
yes, exactly.
Sorry, I got a little interruptive there, but that's all right. My rate
Yeah.
of in responding went up.
Of course, there's a low hanging fruit,
Yeah.
Joe. Okay. Well, this is the way we kick off the new year. This is the way we kick off season 6. Doug, share our last secret word.
Last secret word is lollipop.
There we go.
Yeah.
3 great secret words. And I really would be honest. Like, I love the podcast format, but to be honest, I would just love to have more interactions with the audience because I would love to hear what their thoughts are. Uh, as you pointed out, many people and our listeners are
Yeah.
practitioners and they're doing very good work. And how does this intersect with what they're doing? Are there constraints? Like, I realize that's another issue that we really haven't talked about. We don't have time to talk about it, but certainly there can be constraining elements in your system. Like, let's say you have a supervisor and your supervisor says, nope, you can't do things that way. You got to do it this way. That kind of handcuffs you and doesn't allow you. So those are all of these other issues. And we've talked about this in our paper when we measured uh, when we looked at the graphing and we talked about all of these systems issues. And if we have more time, maybe that's another podcast where we could dive into these system issues. But certainly, I know speaking for you, we just so appreciate what everyone out there is doing and hope that where you can, move to rate of response, move to a standard visual display because you will see a difference. You'll make better decisions. You'll understand what's happening and life will be
Yep.
better.
And that's not an opinion.
And that is not an opinion. That is fact.
Yep.
Okay, well, let's wrap it up there. And let me thank you all for listening and joining us on ABA On Call.
Thanks for watching this episode of ABA On Call. To get your CEU, follow the link and instructions below the video. You can enjoy the program again there, or you can go straight to the attendance verification quiz. Just enter the secret words and pay the CEU fee to generate your certificate.